Hello and welcome to this edition of North Central College's faculty series exploring the ripple effects of COVID-19. My name is Dr. Michael Stefanik. I am an assistant professor of psychology and neuroscience here at North Central, and I'm here today to introduce some of my colleagues in the department as we delve into the understanding of the psychological and physiological consequences that have been associated with this global pandemic. Today, Dr. Maggie, Gill, and myself will first start by talking to you a little bit about why people lose their sense of taste and smell with COVID-19. Next, Dr. Leila Azarbad will talk about COVID-19's influence on stress and the effects that chronic stress can have on our physical and mental health. And finally, Dr. Alexis is going to put together a talk on the negative effects of sleep disruptions resulting from stressors pertaining to COVID-19 and the behaviors that we can all engage in to help promote healthy sleep. We hope you enjoy, we hope you learn something, and please don't hesitate to reach out to any of us if you have any further questions. Thank you. Hi everybody, and welcome. My name is Dr. Michael Stefanik. I am an assistant professor of psychology and neuroscience here at North Central College, and today with Dr. Maggie Gill, we're going to be talking to you today about some new research that's just come out that will help to explain why this loss of smell is such a pervasive symptom with those that come down with COVID-19. To overview what we're going to be talking about today, we're going to basically be doing it in 3 points. The first is, why do we lose our sense of smell when we catch a cold? In the very traditional sense, this is something we've all probably experienced at some point in our lives. This is going to bring us into a little bit about the neurobiology of smell, a little bit of the neuroanatomy, and really how does the brain process this, and maybe what goes wrong from the pathological to even the COVID-19. The second part of this is going to focus on how is this loss of smell different when you get sick with just sort of a general rhinovirus or general cold. How does this differ from COVID-19? We'll talk a little bit about biology of an enzyme called ACE2 and the role that this plays in viral recognition and viral infection. And we'll really be focusing on one specific new paper that came out that really helps to shed some light on the potential mechanism for this. The final piece that wraps this all together is going to be talking about what does this mean for you if you end up being one of these COVID-19 patients. There is some hopeful data at the very end that hopefully will make us all feel a little bit better about this potential recovery from this infection from a neurological standpoint. So as I mentioned, we've all been sick. We've all had some sort of cold, and one of the first things that you always remember about this is that you cannot really smell or taste anything. When you have a cold, you lose your sense of smell, and there really tend to be sort of 3 different reasons why this can occur, ranging from the least severe to the most severe from 1 to 3 here. In the sort of least severe and the most transient is that there tends to be a generalized inflammation in mucus. When this virus invades your body produces white blood cells. Those white blood cells excrete a number of different chemicals aimed at tamping down that virus. But as a biological side effect of this, that those same chemicals also cause tissue inflammation, cellular inflammation, and the generation of things like mucus. We'll see in just a moment that this mucus is going to be what jams up your sense of smell. A little bit more serious here and a little bit more pervasive in terms of how long this will take to recover is that these viruses can actually attack these sensory neurons themselves. We'll talk about these in just a moment in this region called the olfactory epithelium, and how these cells can be potentially vulnerable to COVID-19, and what does this new research tell us about that. And the final one, and oftentimes sometimes the most severe, is that these viruses can attack other kinds of cells, potentially even getting into the brain and causing potential long-lasting loss of smell that may persist throughout the individual's entire life after infection. Thankfully, this doesn't seem to be the case with COVID-19, but we'll explain the exact biology as we walk through the talk today. So the first piece of anatomy here, it seems a little complicated, but let me break it down for you. The first piece of the anatomy that we want to do is basically we split the head in 2, and we're looking sort of at a side view right here inside. So you can see the olfactory epithelium is going to be at the very top. We'll break that down, but here's your nasal cavity, right? Here's what would be your mouth, and there's a few of your teeth there. At the very top of your nasal cavity is a structure called the olfactory epithelium. This is really a sort of bunch of neurons that actually sit in direct contact with the outside environment that actually send projections through what we call the cribiform plate into the brain, and that's how the brain will then send that out to start to process smell. The various memories associated with that, the recognition of smell, all moves on further up, but at least the initial sensory processing takes place in this sort of superficial or dorsal portion of your nasal cavity itself. The interesting thing about these olfactory cells is if you look here, and we see a little zoom in here, is they actually have these little tiny hairs at the bottom. These are called cilia. These cilia are covered with little tiny receptors, and those receptors are responsible for recognizing volatile compounds in the air. So all of these things that you smell have different molecular structures, and those different molecular structures fit into little receptors on these cilia in various combinations that activate different forms of memory based on experience. This is how we get that perception of an orange from the orange that you're cutting in front of you, but also perhaps things that smell like orange. Right now, it's summertime. It's going to be perhaps those orange flavored creamsicle popsicles that you have sort of smell like orange, but not in the same way the actual fresh fruit does. That first level of processing comes into this olfactory epithelium via these cilia that sit on the very top of your nasal cavity. What happens when you get sick? Those secretory cells, excrete mucus, right? There may be some cellular inflammation. What essentially that does is that layer of mucus and that inflammation blocks the ability for these cilia to process smell in the same way that you would be processing it if you were healthy. And so this is a very important first step in this signal transduction of a volatile solvent to an actual perceived memory here. But the other thing you might be thinking of right now is say, okay, people lose smell, but one of the things that always happens to me when I get sick is I lose the ability to taste. Taste might not be the operative word in this case. We actually might be looking at what we would call in the scientific discipline flavor. And flavor is actually a combination of pure taste. This is going to be sensed by the taste buds on your tongue. This is the sour, the salty, the sweet, the bitter, etc. And a combination of smell. Smell is going to take about 80% of that burden for you. Right? So if you don't have those sensory receptors in that olfactory epithelium working properly, you're not going to be able to smell the food. And then you're not going to have that full, rich sensory perception. Sure, you can tell if it's salty or sweet or sour, but you're not going to be able to, quote unquote, taste it as you normally would if you're healthy. And so this is going to go hand in hand, but really what we'll be focusing on for this talk and the paper that we'll be presenting to you today is specifically the receptors in this olfactory epithelium before this information actually gets to the brain. And so again, we've all had this problem, right? We've gotten sick, we can't smell anything, we're really stuffed up. What are some potential causes for this, right? It can be due to that inflammation in mucus that will go away in a couple of days. The virus can actually attack the cells in this olfactory epithelium, causing them to die. Or they could actually be causing much longer things. If they do tend to get into the brain, they can actually be causing problems that will be persistent throughout the life. And so what we can do from this is we can extrapolate what these three functions are, these three potential causes, to come up with three different hypotheses as for what might be driving this loss of COVID-19 related smell. The first that we'll address very quickly is inflammation in mucus, and the last two are really going to be the focus of the paper that we'll be presenting to you very shortly. Dr. Gill will touch on that, looking at whether or not the SARS-CoV-2 virus is responsible for attacking the sensory neurons in this olfactory epithelium directly, or is it actually going to be attacking some of the support cells or maybe other kinds of cells in this really complex structure we know as the brain. And so one of the peculiar features about this COVID-19 pandemic is that in about 60 to 70% of individuals, they report losing their smell. And a really important feature of this, and this is something that gives us a clue as to one of our first hypotheses that we can perhaps rule out, is that this loss of smell, and we call this anosmia in the field, this loss of smell is actually going to be a symptom that sometimes and most oftentimes precedes the onset of other types of symptoms related to viral infection. This is one of the earliest signs of COVID-19 infection and oftentimes sort of one of the harbingers of what's going to be coming in terms of the other types of physical symptoms you'll experience later. One important note, and Dr. Gill will address this and wrap this up at the very end, is that this smell loss precedes the onset of all of their symptoms, but also takes a little bit longer even after individuals have recovered to come back. And so the important thing here to note is the time frame. This is going to take several weeks, and these individuals, for the most part, what we're seeing is they're reporting that the sense of smell, that taste, That flavor does come back, but it takes several weeks following them getting better for that to do so. This is going to provide a really important clue when we talk about that second hypothesis in just a moment, is that this seems to be much quicker than if it was actually attacking neurons themselves. Neurons in the olfactory epithelium do have the capacity to repair and regenerate to some extent, but oftentimes that takes about 30 days or so. By speeding up the time frame and the smell recovery comes back within a matter of weeks, we can start to think about perhaps maybe this isn't going to be necessarily directly attacking those neurons, or at least not solely attacking those neurons, because simply the time scale it would take for those neurons to regenerate isn't being followed in these individuals that are recovering from COVID-19 infection. And so when we look at those three hypotheses, we can start to rule things out. And the first thing that we can rule out is that inflammation and mucus. Individuals that are sick that report that loss of smell before they have any inflammation, before they get the sniffles, before they get stuffed up, if they do at all. This seems to be preceding those symptoms by such a wide margin that we can generally assume that this is probably not a mechanism by which this virus is interacting with the olfactory epithelium. This leaves us with two hypotheses then left. Either the virus is directly attacking these nerve cells, or it's going to be attacking other kinds of cells. And this is going to be what Dr. Gill will be addressing in the following paper.
Hi, I'm Dr. Maggie Gill, and I'm an associate professor at North Central College, and I'm going to pick up talking to you about the article Non-Neuronal Expression of SARS-CoV-2 Entry Genes in the Olfactory System Suggests Mechanisms Underlying COVID-19 Associated Anosmia. So this study investigated what type of cells in the olfactory epithelium are most vulnerable to COVID-19. So as you can see in this image that's similar to the one that Dr. Stefanik explained, you can see the nose, and this is where the particles come up into the olfactory epithelium, where they are identified, processed, and then they go up to the olfactory bulb and the brain. Okay, now when we look at the olfactory epithelium and the olfactory bulb in the brain, there are the neurons there, and these are what send information for communication. And then there's a lot of other cells there, and these other cells are support cells for those neurons. Okay, so they do things like provide nutrients for those neurons. They are responsible for metabolism as well as blood supply. So the researchers in this study were specifically interested in where this SARS-CoV-2 could potentially be impacting in the olfactory epithelium and olfactory bulb. And to do this, they labeled for an enzyme called ACE2. Now, ACE2 stands for Angiotensin-converting enzyme 2, and it is the enzyme in the body responsible for blood pressure and salt retention, and it's specifically found in cells in the respiratory tract, right? So what happens, as you can see here, we've got our cell in gray with our lipid bilayer, and in blue right here, you see that these are actually the ACE2 enzymes, okay? And what happens with these ACE2 enzymes is that you can see in the spheres there is the SARS-CoV-2. And this SARS-CoV-2 is going to bind to the extracellular domain of these ACE2 enzymes and endocytose. So basically what that SARS-CoV-2 is doing is, by endocytosing, it's entering the cell, okay? And so specifically that makes sense, right? Why they are found in the respiratory tract is we know that's where SARS-CoV-2 is entering our body, okay? Now, with labeling then for these ACE2 enzymes, they're able to find out whether the neurons or the support cells in our olfactory epithelium are actually the ones that are affecting our smell, okay? So they labeled and stained for these ACE2 enzymes, and what they found is that ACE2 is actually not expressed on neurons. It's expressed in the support cells and blood vessels, and this is shown in green on these images here, okay? What this means is that it's expressed in the support cells and blood vessels and not on the neurons, is that it is going to indirectly impact these neurons. So it's still going to have an impact and play a role, but it's not the neurons specifically that are affected, and it's these support cells that are likely responsible for the COVID-related anosmia. So going back to our 3 hypotheses, this is actually really good news, right? We've already ruled out that it's not inflammation and mucus, right? And this study just ruled out that it isn't the viruses attacking the sensory neurons, and it is in fact that the virus is attacking other kinds of cells here. So why is this such good news? This means that the neurons don't need to be repaired or replaced. So if you recall from what Dr. Stefanik said, that when our neurons are impacted here by virus, it can permanently impact them so that individuals never recover their sense of smell, which we know then that is not the case if it is not impacting those neurons. And those neurons, if they are just impacted and not long term, they do regenerate, but it takes about 30 days for them to regenerate, and that means that the smell would be gone for months, or a few months most likely. Where with COVID-19, we see that it is a longer term, right? People experience anosmia for a few weeks, but it's not that long term, okay? So ultimately, this is really good news because it means while people that have COVID-19 really feel like it's a long time and want to get their smell back, relatively speaking, if it was affecting the neurons, it is not that long time and they will recover that sense of smell. When I showed you that diagram of the olfactory epithelium and the olfactory bulb, right, you saw that those projections went up to the brain. So you may be curious as to whether SARS-CoV-2 does impact the brain, as a lot of the symptoms that you're seeing are kind of confusion, there's memory symptoms, a lot of them related to the brain. And so not a whole lot of studies have been done with this, but this study did also stain for that ACE2 enzyme in the brain. And again, they found that ACE2 was not present in neurons, but it was present on those support cells, in particular in those support cells on the blood vessels in the brain. So if you think of kind of that outer layer of a blood vessel, that's or the outside of it, that's where these ACE2 receptors are found. Now, what is interesting with this, so yes, it can indirectly impact the neurons, but it is also this ACE2, because it's on those blood vessels, there are high quantities of it in the blood-brain barrier. And then if anyone has taken the upper level neuroscience classes here at North Central College that are watching, you know that while this may not have immediate effects with the blood-brain barrier, it will be interesting to see with studies what this means down the road, because the blood-brain barrier actually plays a large role in neurological disorders, other psychological disorders and things of the brain. So research in years to come with this impact overall and long-term impact of SARS-CoV-2 on the brain will be interesting to see. So this is the reference for the paper that I just discussed. We want to thank you for joining us today to learn about why individuals lose their sense of smell with SARS-CoV-2. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. My name is Dr. Leila Azarbad. I am a licensed clinical psychologist and a professor of psychology at North Central College. And I'm here today to talk with you about COVID-19 and its effects on our stress levels. So it's not going to be a surprise to learn that the pandemic has increased stress for millions of individuals around the globe. When we talk about stress, we're defining it as a behavioral and a cognitive response to a perceived threat. So we can very quickly see how a pandemic could be perceived as a threat, right? Not only to our health, but to our financial health, to our social well-being, to our mental health, etc. Despite the fact that we've been dealing with this pandemic for a few months, we already have quite a bit of published research on how people are coping with this significant stressor. We have some data coming out of the US and Canada that is telling us that about 28% of Americans and Canadians are reporting moderate to severe levels of stress in response to the pandemic. In Chinese samples, about a quarter of those adults are reporting moderate to severe levels of stress in response to the pandemic. And it should be noted that that 25% in the Chinese samples is similar to what we observed during the SARS outbreak and also during the 2009 H1N1 pandemic. What are some of the common stressors that people are worrying about? Well, not surprisingly, fears about contamination and contracting COVID-19 are a primary concern. But in addition to that, people are very stressed about the economy and their work. We're also seeing stress around compulsive checking and reassurance seeking. So many times when people have health-related anxiety, we see them engage in compulsive checking. So as one example, suppose that someone has a tickle in their throat and they start becoming concerned that this might be COVID related. They might continually start to swallow or to clear their throat in an attempt to kind of check and see if this is a cough or more of an ache. They might also engage in a lot of reassurance seeking. So they might ask other people, do you think I should get a COVID test? Do you think that my cough is reason for concern? And certainly those behaviors can produce a lot of stress for people. We might also see symptoms that mimic symptoms of trauma. So that would be things like having nightmares about the pandemic, being on edge, being hypervigilant. And of course, in addition to those stressors, social distancing has led to a lot of loneliness for many people, and that can be very stressful. And of course, social distancing and stay-at-home mandates have led many people to experience pretty significant changes to their daily routines. And all of those things have been very, very stressful for people around the globe. What you're looking at here is data from YouGov, which has tracked thousands of people across the globe, but here you're looking at particular in American data. So on the x-axis down there, you're looking at dates ranging from March 3rd all the way here on the left, all the way to July 29th. And on the y-axis here, you're looking at percentage of people in the United States who say that they are either very or somewhat scared that they will contract COVID-19. So we can see that in early March, about 35% of Americans were either very or somewhat scared of contracting the virus. When you look fast forward to the end of March, 60% of Americans were somewhat or very scared of contracting the virus. And that makes sense. We saw that big spike. We saw many states have state closures, stay-at-home mandates. So that was really the peak of people's anxiety about contracting COVID in this country. We saw a little bit of relief in mid-June when the percentage dropped to 50%. And as of the very end of July, we were back up to about 58%. So certainly fears of contamination are still at the forefront of people's stress levels. And that seems to also correspond with the region in which where you live and whether or not there is an uptick in the number of cases. So we are seeing people reporting significant stress about getting COVID in all regions except for the Northeast. So if you look over here at the Northeast, you can see that over time, the percentage of people that are scared about contracting the virus has decreased somewhat from 70% down to 61%. In all other regions, you're seeing an increase, and you're seeing the greatest increase in the South and the West, which consequently happen to be the regions where we're seeing spikes in cases. Going back to talking about the economy and work as significant stressors for people, about 7 out of 10 Americans are reporting that their work and the economy are significant sources of stress. And this data is coming out of the American Psychological Association that has been collecting data from over 3,000 adults ages 18 and over every month for the past 3 months, specifically looking at COVID-19 and how it's affecting people's stress. interesting to compare people's stress to where it was about a year ago in August of 2019. You can see economy-related stress was being endorsed by about 46% of people, work-related stress, 64% of people, but now we're up to about 70%. Although people in the general population are reporting a lot of stress, there are two subgroups that are particularly vulnerable to stress at this time. And one of those subgroups are parents. Parents are reporting significant levels of stress as compared to non-parents. So what you can see there on this figure is on a scale of 1 to 10, the parents that were surveyed reported their average stress level to be about a 6.7 during the coronavirus pandemic compared to a 5.5 for non-parents. When we ask parents, what are some of the things that are producing your stress? About 7 out of 10 parents are worried about the pandemic's impact on their children's social development. And over half of parents are reporting that their child's behavior has been disrupted since the start of the pandemic. They're seeing more outbursts, more acting out, and so on and so forth. So certainly parents seem to be particularly vulnerable to stress at this time. In addition to these concerns, about 70% of parents are also reporting stress around homeschooling their children. And also 70% are reporting stress around access to getting their basic needs met, which is particularly worrisome during this time. The other subgroup that appears to be particularly vulnerable to stress are individuals of color. And so what you're looking at here is data on percentage of people that are worried about either getting coronavirus, getting their basic needs met, and having access to healthcare. The blue bar represents ethnic minorities or people of color. The orange bar represents Caucasians. And what you can see is that across all three stressors, individuals of color are reporting higher stress, whether it's about contracting the disease, getting their basic needs met, or having access to healthcare. So unfortunately, the social disparities that we see in healthcare in this country continue to be intensified during the pandemic. During this time, not only have we been dealing with a global pandemic, but in this country, we've also been struggling with significant social unrest. We have many protests around racial injustice. We have seen really kind of a revolution of sorts when it comes to protesting against discrimination and social injustice in this country. And so when you overlay that on top of COVID-19, 72% of Americans are saying that this is actually the lowest point in history that they can remember. Compare that to 56% a couple years ago and 59% back in 2017. So although we're focusing on COVID-19 for this webinar, we have to also consider other things that are happening in our nation that is no doubt affecting people's stress levels. So the question now becomes, why is it important to understand people's stress during a pandemic? Of course, stress is unpleasant, but why is it so important? In addition to it being unpleasant, we need to understand why it's important to study this. And one of the key reasons why this is so important is that we know that stress is an important driver of people's behavior. So COVID-19 is a disease that is largely impacted by human behavior. While we're waiting for a pharmaceutical treatment or a vaccine to be designed, we are left to human behavior to slow down the spread of the virus. So things like encouraging hand washing, wearing a mask, practicing social distancing, these are all human behaviors that can slow the spread of the virus. And stress can actually help us predict who is going to engage in those health behaviors. So what we've seen from previous pandemics is that people who experience low levels of stress, those people that say, I'm really not worried about the virus, or even if I were to contract it, I probably wouldn't become very sick. Those people that are low stress are those people that are likely to display an absence of health protective behaviors. So those might be the people that are less willing to socially distance, to wear a mask, etc. On the flip side, individuals who are very high stress around the pandemic, that are very concerned about it, might engage in socially disruptive behaviors. So they might be more likely to hoard toilet paper, to stock up on hundreds of gallons of hand sanitizer, to visit the doctor in response to mild symptoms, but they're concerned that they might have COVID-19. So again, stress is really important because it can help us predict human behavior, and that's so critical during this time. There are a couple other reasons why it's really important to understand people's stress levels. And the second reason is that we know that stress influences people's mental health. People that report high levels of stress are at higher risk for developing mental health conditions such as depression, anxiety disorders, substance use disorders. What you're looking at here is data on percentage of adults who say that stress related to COVID has had a negative impact on their mental health. So this top bar here is looking at people who say that they're in either good, very good, or excellent health. And of those people, 17% are still saying that COVID-related stress is negatively impacting their mental health. But take a look at what happens to that percentage when we look at people who say that they're in fair or poor health. That percentage jumps to 29%. So nearly 3 out of every 10 people who are in poor health are saying COVID-19 has negatively impacted their mental health. So this is undoubtedly a psychiatric concern as well. I think this data is particularly telling when it comes to how people are reacting psychiatrically to the pandemic. What you're looking at here is data from January 19th up until March 15th, and you're looking at percentage of change in prescriptions filled for mental health medications. So that's medications in particular for depression, anxiety, and insomnia. And what you see is that from January to February, we saw a mild increase in prescriptions, in psychiatric prescriptions. But then take a look at what happens from February 16th to March 15th. We are seeing significant increases in the number of prescriptions filled. In particular for benzodiazepines, which are anti-anxiety medications, we saw a 34% increase just in that mid-February to mid-March time period. Now keep in mind that March 15th marks the week where the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 as a pandemic. And also right around that time was when many states started to implement shelter-in-place orders. So that was really kind of the start of COVID-19's effects in the United States. What I think is particularly interesting to note is that 78% of all antidepressant, anti-anxiety, and anti-insomnia prescriptions that were filled during the week of March 15th were for new prescriptions. So these were for individuals that were not prior taking these medications. So we can perhaps ascertain that COVID-19 and the pandemic and the stress of all of that might have led people to experience significant increase in psychiatric symptoms and then reach out for a prescription for the first time. So undoubtedly, stress from the pandemic is adversely affecting people's mental health. And finally, it's really important to study stress during this time because stress can also affect our physical health. We know from research that stress can increase one's risk for high blood pressure. It increases our risk for heart attack, for stroke, for high cholesterol. We know that when you're under chronic stress, we are secreting a stress hormone called cortisol. And cortisol, when we're chronically exposed to cortisol, will promote inflammation in the body. And so that can over time lead to tissue damage. It can slow down healing when you have an injury. It can lead to aches and pains. It can slow down our digestion because, again, when we're under chronic stress, your body's resources are being funneled to coping with a stressor. You don't have much reserve left over for things like reproduction, ovulation, digesting your food properly. This is why many people might experience gastrointestinal symptoms when they're under chronic stress, chronic stomach aches, diarrhea, constipation, etc. And I think what's particularly noteworthy, because we're talking about a pandemic and everyone wants to have their immune system be in the best shape possible, is that we know that chronic stress weakens the immune system. Over time, exposure to cortisol will weaken our immune cells. And so when we are exposed to virus, our immune cells are less able to ward off and fight off those pathogens. And so that's particularly important at this time to ensure that we're keeping our stress levels at an appropriate place and that we're not becoming overly stressed, because that will reduce our immune functioning, which will increase our susceptibility to getting sick if we're faced with some kind of virus, whether it be COVID-19, a common cold, a flu, or any other kind of virus. And so then that begs the final question: what can we do to reduce our stress levels? This is particularly important right now. But it's oftentimes the basic things that go overlooked, but that can have a huge impact. Proper nutrition, making sure we're eating well, that we're getting enough exercise, we're exercising regularly, that we're getting enough sleep. All of those things are critical. And my colleague, Dr. Chambers, is going to talk with us shortly about how to promote healthy sleep. Staying connected with other people. It can be a challenge during social distancing, but getting creative and perhaps relying on technology or connecting with other people safely is going to be really important. We're social creatures. We need that social connection. Engaging in enjoyable activities to the extent that you're possible. Finding ways to modify the things that you used to enjoy if you're not able to engage in them in the traditional sense. It's going to be really important. Unplugging is critical at this time. You turn on the news and we are inundated with distressing updates about COVID-19, about what's going on around the world in our country. And so making sure that we find time to unplug from that and take breaks to silence that cell phone and put it away, in particular in the evening before bedtime. Taking those breaks are critical. And of course, knowing that professional support is always available. If you are trying to reduce stress on your own and you're finding that that's just not enough, know that there are professionals out there, counselors, psychologists, who have additional tools and techniques that they can teach you so that you can sufficiently keep your stress under control during this very stressful time. I wish you all well. And now I'm going to pass it on to my colleague, Dr. Chambers, who's going to talk with you about the importance of sleep during the pandemic. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Alexis Chambers and I'm an assistant professor of psychology and neuroscience, and I'm going to talk to you about COVID-19 and your sleep. Let's start with a definition of sleep. Many may think that sleep is just a time when the brain shuts down and nothing interesting is going on, but there's actually a lot going on while you're asleep, and it would be best described as a series of different brain states where we're going to note changes in behavior, changes in activity of different brain regions, and changes in the concentration of various neurotransmitters, which are the chemicals that allow your neurons or brain cells to communicate with one another. In research and medical settings, we can differentiate these brain states using a technique called polysomnography, or PSG. This entails attaching electrodes to areas of the scalp and face so that we can record brain activity, eye movements, and muscle tone to determine which stage of sleep you're in at any given time during the night. Now, there are a variety of different sleep stages that you will experience throughout the night, and you cycle through these gradually. So you start off in a very light stage of sleep known as non-REM stage 1, and you gradually cycle through deeper and deeper stages through stage 2 and into stage 3, which is your deepest stage of sleep. We also refer to this stage as slow wave sleep because of the large brain waves that we'll see during this particular state. It's very difficult to wake up out of this state. You may feel groggy if you do, and we also note decreased brain activity during this state as well. Now, these first 3 stages are referred to as non-REM sleep, which differentiates them from the last stage known as REM sleep, or rapid eye movement sleep. This is where a lot of your dreaming occurs, especially those bizarre and disjointed dreams that don't seem strange until you wake up. And you're paralyzed during this time as well, and for good reason. If you weren't, you would be in danger of acting out the things that you're dreaming. We also will note an increase in brain activity during this particular stage. Now, your sleep architecture, or the cycle of these sleep stages throughout the night, is really important. And you don't just cycle through each of these stages and then wake up. Rather, you cycle through each of them roughly every 90 minutes throughout the night. But the amount of time that you spend in each stage changes throughout the night. So early in the night, you're going to spend more time in non-REM stage 3. You're going to get more of that particular stage in the first half of the night, whereas in the second half of the night, you're going to get more of your REM sleep. Now, most adults need around 7 to 9 hours of sleep each night to ensure that they're getting the proper amount of each of these kinds of sleep. But that can be hard sometimes, right? Life gets in the way, and sometimes it's hard to get the appropriate amount of sleep, and we're going to talk about that. But first, I also want to mention some effects or some factors that can affect our timing of sleep, which can also play a role sometimes in the amount of sleep we're getting as well. So we are diurnal animals, meaning that we are awake during the day and we are asleep at night. And in fact, your brain responds to sunlight, which it uses as a cue to tell us that we should be awake during the day. Sunlight comes in through the eye and impacts a structure deep in the middle of your brain known as the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is our master clock. This particular area of the brain is responsible for orchestrating our sleep and wake cycle, as well as many other cycles that are occurring throughout the body. One thing that it can influence is the production of melatonin, which we see starts to increase a couple of hours before we go to bed. It peaks during the night and starts to drop off once we are asleep. There are also social and genetic factors that can play a role in our sleep timing as well. So if you're the type of person that likes to get up early and go to bed early, we would affectionately call you a morning lark or a morning person. And as you well know, there are also night owls who like to stay up late and sleep in late as well. And people can also kind of fall in between these two extremes as well. So there are a number of factors here that can impact our sleep and our sleep timing, and we know a little bit about sleep now, so let's turn our attention to the pandemic and how it might be affecting our sleep. I'm going to focus this conversation on stress because there are a lot of people out there experiencing stress related to the pandemic, and there's research that shows what stress can do to our sleep. So you may find that you have trouble initially falling asleep during the night, or maybe you wake up several hours before you need to and can't fall back asleep. In that case, you'd be experiencing insomnia. You may also experience sleep fragmentation, which refers to these brief repeated awakenings throughout the night. And in some cases, you may not even be aware that you've been waking up multiple times throughout the night. This is problematic, however, because it can eat into your sleep time and leave you feeling extremely tired the next day. As many of you well know, we can also see an increase in nightmares because of stress, and research has also shown that stress can affect those sleep stages I was talking about, altering their timing or the way that we may transition from one stage to the next. Now, an important note that I should make here is that not everyone is going to experience effects to their sleep in response to stress in the same way. So some people may have a harder time sleeping because of stress, where some people may not have much trouble at all. If you do feel like your sleep is being impacted, though, it is important to pay attention. And here's the part where I want to tell you why it's important to care about getting the right amount of sleep and good sleep quality. Now, I will warn you, this is the part where I try to scare you a little bit, but I only do it because I care. So there's been a lot of research that has looked into sleep, insufficient sleep or sleep deprivation, and any kinds of health or safety issues that might be associated. A quick note on sleep deprivation or insufficient sleep, because I'll be referring to that quite a bit. We might think of sleep deprivation as meaning that you've stayed up for an entire night, pulling an all-nighter, so to speak. But if you are getting less than the recommended amount of sleep pretty chronically, so if you're getting less than those 7 to 9 hours each night, you can still be sleep deprived. So even if you're getting 5 to 6 hours of sleep each night pretty consistently, that still counts as sleep deprivation. Research has shown that people who consistently get 6 hours or fewer of sleep each night have double the risk of falling asleep at the wheel. And some researchers have estimated that somewhere around 20% of car accidents may be the result of drowsy driving. Researchers have also found an association between short sleep or sleeping less than the recommended amount and heart attack, developing heart disease, stroke, and there's also an association between insufficient sleep and obesity and type 2 diabetes. Some research has also found that sleep-deprived people have brain responses to food that suggests that sleep deprivation might be impacting their food choices, leading to higher calorie food choices, for instance. There's also a plethora of research that shows a connection between sleep abnormalities or sleep problems and various mental health concerns. So for instance, chronic insomnia can put people at higher risk for developing depression based on what some of the research shows. Probably most relevant to our discussion about the pandemic is the research that has been conducted looking at the link between sleep deprivation and the immune system. Research has found that sleep deprivation may impact the concentration of various immune cells and other factors that could put people at risk for developing illness. In one study, they found that people who were consistently getting less than 7 hours of sleep each night and who had poor sleep quality were at higher risk of developing the common cold in response to being exposed to the rhinovirus compared to people who were sleeping well. They've also investigated responses to vaccine under sleep deprivation. They found in one study that participants who were partially sleep deprived in the days leading up to and during the flu vaccine had antibody concentrations that were half of those who were allowed to sleep normally. And I should note that the partial sleep deprivation in this study meant that people were sleeping 4 hours each night for 6 nights straight. Similar results were found with a hepatitis A vaccine study. People who were sleep deprived the night following hepatitis A vaccination had lower antibody concentrations than those who were allowed to sleep normally. And this was even 4 weeks later. So obviously, there are some troubling connections between insufficient sleep and health and safety concerns. So we really need to take this seriously. If you feel like you're not getting the right amount of sleep, you really owe it to yourself to try to do something to better your sleep. But the next question is, if that's you, what can you do? A good place to start is sleep hygiene. Sleep hygiene refers to a number of behaviors that you can engage in at home on your own time that promote sleep. You're seeing a list of some of those behaviors here. So we want to do things like maintaining a consistent bedtime and wake-up time, not just through the week, but on weekends as well. We also want to engage in relaxing activities before bed. So this is where we want to really try to manage those stressors. Some have suggested that keeping a worry journal is effective. This is where you write down all of your worries, and that allows you to sort of set them aside so that you can sleep. Mindfulness and meditation may also be good ways to help you relax before bed. This requires us to focus on the here and now, pulling our attention away from those past regrets or those future worries that might just come crashing down on us as soon as our head hits the pillow. Whatever it is you do, you want to make sure that you engage in something that calms you down before bed. And try to make this a routine. Set aside maybe a half hour to an hour each night before bed, if you're able, and do something that is relaxing. You also want to limit your exposure to bright lights in the evening. Remember, our brain uses sunlight or light as a cue to tell us that we need to be awake. And in many cases, we do mean sunlight when we talk about this. However, artificial light can have the same effect. This means indoor lighting and also the light that is emitted from all those devices that you're constantly using, like your laptop, phone, and tablet. Research has shown that being exposed to light from some of these devices can delay melatonin release and can also push bedtimes later, which can result then in less sleep during the night, especially if you need to get up at a particular time in the morning. We also want to make sure that our sleep environment is quiet, cool, and comfortable. We want to set the thermostat low. We don't want to get too hot during the night. That'll cause us to wake up. And of course, noises can be a problem, so we want to try to eliminate those. Research has suggested that maintaining a regular exercise routine may also help sleep if you're able to kind of make a habit out of it. And you also want to avoid stimulants, especially late in the day. So stimulants include things like caffeine, which can peak in your bloodstream somewhere between 30 to 60 minutes after you've consumed it. And caffeine actually stays in your system for quite some time. The half-life of caffeine has been estimated anywhere from 3 to 7 hours, meaning that if you have a cup of coffee in the afternoon, that could still be affecting you by the time you are trying to go to bed. You also want to avoid alcohol before bed. This may be kind of a surprise to some of you because alcohol tends to make us feel relaxed and sleepy. And maybe it does help you initially fall asleep, but research has shown that as our body breaks down and metabolizes alcohol, it can affect our sleep architecture. Especially, it seems like sleep that's occurring in the second half of the night, resulting in a reduction, in some studies, a reduction in the amount of REM sleep that you get. So some have referred to it as a REM suppressant. This can leave you feeling tired the next day. This point goes along with the next one, and that is that you want to limit the amount of fluids that you're drinking before bed as well, alcohol or otherwise. If you drink a lot of fluids before bed, it's going to be your bladder that's waking you up during the night. And then finally, if you've spent a while in bed, lying there, trying to go to bed, maybe 20 minutes or more, some have also suggested that you get up out of bed and do something relaxing for a while until you're sleepy and then try again. The reason is because, we don't want to associate our bed with stress. And that's what can start to happen if night after night you're lying there trying and failing to fall asleep. You're having trouble falling asleep because you're stressed about something, but then what happens is you start clock watching and worrying about the number of hours you're going to get, and it starts this vicious cycle where you're not sleeping because you're stressed about not sleeping. Too many times of that, and you start to associate your bed with a stress response, which is not conducive to falling asleep. Now, if you try these things for a while and it's still not working, see a doctor. Your doctor can help you out here. Maybe there's something else going on that's responsible for your poor sleep. Maybe they can refer you to a specialist. I know that can seem kind of annoying, but as we've seen, there are some important connections between sleep and good health, so you really owe it to yourself to make sure that you're getting good sleep. You deserve it, right? That's all that I have for you guys. Thank you so much for listening. I want to thank my wonderful colleagues for sharing their wisdom with us as well. And I want to remind you that we will be available to answer your questions August 18th at 7 p.m. Central Time. Thanks so much.